We're in the month of October, which means Halloween, horror movies, and all things spooky. So what better time to dive into George Lynch's killer solo on Dream Warriors. Dokken, of course, wrote and recorded that song for the movie A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, which is one of my favorite campy, old-school 80s horror movies. Now, to be honest, I've been wanting to cover this solo for some time on the channel, so I'm really glad that we're finally going to get into it and break it down lick by lick. But first, let's talk about George Lynch real quick. And if you want to get right to learning the solo, there are timestamps in the video description, so you can click on lick by lick breakdown and skip this next part entirely. I do, however, recommend you watch this the whole way through, at least for the first time, because this is one of those solos that guitar players have a real hard time reproducing accurately. So I'm going to try to explain why that is and what you can do to play this solo so that it sounds a bit more like George. Now, for me, George Lynch has always been a source of inspiration and, at the same time, a source of incredible frustration. Let me explain. There are players whose style I can emulate more closely than others. Adrian Smith and Randy Rhoads, for example, are easier for me to copy than Eddie Van Halen. Now, I'm not referring to the difficulty of their licks or the techniques that they use. I'm just talking about simply reproducing one of their solos, everything else being equal. And a lot of it is mostly due to playing style. Adrian and Randy's articulation, their sense of time and rhythmic feel are just closer to my own than Eddie's. But anytime I tried learning a George Lynch solo, I always ended up sounding like I had learned it from a transcription without actually having heard it. And of course, for a long time, I didn't actually have the chops to play a lot of his more difficult licks, but even when my skill level finally got to a point where I could play them, it still sounded like I was playing something I didn't quite understand. And that's because I didn't. A lot of it has to do with George's touch. Just the way that he naturally picks and frets notes. And his legato sounds like he has very strong hands, by the way. It's also his rather unusual sense of rhythm and how he uses slides, hammer-ons, and pull-offs naturally in the same way that we would simply fret a note. And that can be tricky, especially if you're learning the solo from a tab or a tutorial, because for most of us who don't approach notes that way, we tend to think of those slides, hammer-ons, and pull-offs as actual notes. In reality, George uses them as grace notes, little embellishments that aren't really part of the actual melody. They're a way to add a little flair to the main notes and to make the phrase sound a little more unique, and in George's case, they're an important part of his playing style. Another aspect of George Lynch's playing that makes it so hard to copy is the element of improvisation. He's exceptionally good at playing off the cuff, and it's not just because he knows a lot of licks and how to land on chord tones. Those things may be important to a degree, but most experienced guitar players can do that without necessarily being good at improvising. So aside from knowing the fretboard, having a repertoire of licks and phrasing ideas, and knowing how to land on the right tones within a chord progression, George also has a very developed sense of melody, pacing, and how to play with tension and release. So he can start a phrase out of the blue and from there develop it melodically and thematically so it'll give the listener a sense of direction. Although he does like to subvert our expectations of where the thing is going to go. And I'm pretty sure this is the approach he might take even when working solos out for the record. So he might jam over the progression until something cool comes out of it, make a note of that, and then play some more, but keep that cool bit in that same spot, and so on until the solo ends up being sort of mapped out. Then, after he records it, he might forget all about it, which would explain why a lot of his live solos feature a lot of improvisation rather than being note-for-note renditions of the recorded solo. For Dream Warriors, I believe he just recorded a few takes pretty much off the cuff, although I have no idea how much of it, if any, he might have already had worked out beforehand. But either way, the solo does have a very spontaneous energy and a real unique flow to it. So it's definitely not something that was fully worked out note for note. So it's important to keep this in mind when learning a solo like Dream Warriors, because it can be endlessly frustrating to try to figure out note for note a solo that was recorded with a certain degree of spontaneity. It's also less likely to sound like the original because you're not going to transcribe it with the same free-flowing time feel, so those little in-between notes or happy accident type of bits will sound stiff and unnatural. As a guitar player, it's important to know when to quote a solo or a lick exactly note for note, and when it's more about the feel, the flow, and the overall sense of the thing. So with that in mind, I did try to figure out George Lynch's original Dream Warriors solo as close to note for note as I could, because I wanted to be able to play it like it is on the album. And I'm pretty sure you felt the same at some point. I tried to figure out a big chunk from the original song and the isolated lead guitar track at normal speed as much as possible, just to make sure that I didn't lose the flow. And then for the really tricky bits, I slowed down the isolated lead guitar to catch more of the exact notes and the subtleties. Now, if I had to cover the song live, I probably wouldn't play it exactly like this because it might come across a bit too stiff, and then the ad-lib style flow and fluidity of those legato lines are a big part of what makes it sound so catchy and so thrilling. But I will admit, it is a lot of fun to try to replicate it when I'm jamming at home with Dokken. Okay, so now let's analyze this solo lick by lick and examine what George is doing, why he's doing it in the sense of the role it plays in making the solo as good as it is, and any key points that might help you get it to sound a little more like him when you play it. As always, I'll start with a quick look at the rhythm guitar accompaniment, as it's crucial to have a clear understanding of the chord changes and the broader context of the solo. Like the rest of the song, we're in the key of A minor, and it goes something like this. So it's a pretty standard heavy rock chord progression, but with a few suspensions as embellishments to add a bit of color. So you get this A minor to A sus2, and then you get the C sus4 to C major. It's not that noticeable in the mix, but it does make a difference when the accompaniment has a bit more depth like that. So George starts his solo with this instantly recognizable first lick. Now already here we have some really neat things going on. The first note is a whole step bend from C to D that he bends up an additional step all the way up to E before releasing back to C. It's very important to make those bends very precise and hit the target notes as close to dead on as possible so that it sounds like this. And when you're practicing this, it can be really helpful to play it as fretted notes first to get the exact target pitches in your ear. Then try to hit them precisely as bends. And if you want this to sound even more like George, you'll want to make sure that the two picked notes are picked with just a little bit of a pinch. Now I like to angle my pick a little bit and I hit the string with a sort of scooping motion and get some of the flesh of my thumb on there as well to get that partial harmonic. Then you have some quick legato. And there seems to be some of George's slide vibrato on that last note, just for effect. Now the next short phrase is harmonized up or down, depending on which line you hear as the main melody, with fourths. The lower one goes, and this is the higher one. I like to play the lower one, or you could play them together as dyads. Now from here, it already starts to get tricky because he's throwing all sorts of small Lynchisms in every lick. And the timing here has a bit of a loose feel, so the notes don't have a precisely equal or proportionate duration. You can of course play it a bit more evenly, but this slightly uneven timing gives George that slinky, slippery sound. It sounds dangerous, even if he is in complete control of what he's doing. Now the next part flows naturally from that last note. And again here, the timing isn't precisely even. It sounds wild and a little out of control. But pay attention to the accented notes because those fall precisely on the downbeats every time. And that's an important detail because it's what keeps the whole thing grounded. The next one is a bit simpler, but still a bit tricky for the flow and rhythm. You see what I mean about that ad-lib kind of flow? Now, Randy Rhoads also used to play a variation of this lick, but he would do it a bit more like this. Now, George's timing is less precise, but more fluid, and that can make it a bit more difficult to nail down. So here are a few key points for this lick. Hit those accents on the downbeats at the end when you reel it back in. Angle your pick so that you get a lower timbre on the last notes of the G string. And then make sure that you hit that pinch harmonic on that last note. So from there, he continues with this. Now this is one of those things I was talking about earlier where you might be tempted to play all the notes the same way, kind of like this. And you obviously could do it that way and it'll still be a cool lick. But if you want it to sound like what George recorded, it's better to think of this part as something like this. And then squeeze those other notes in between the melody, more as stylistic embellishments. And that brings us to the second harmonized lick, and this one is just all kinds of weird. So the main line goes something like this. So let me do that again a little slower. And the harmony isn't parallel to the main line, and it's not even the exact same amount of notes. He's holding that first bend for an extra beat or so, and then he goes into the descending run after it's already started. I don't know if this is exactly note for note, but it's pretty much like this. It's really strange and a bit awkward, but it sounds so badass on the record. I don't even know how he came up with that, or maybe it was one of those happy accidents, who knows. And now we're at the closing line just before the solo's climax. This part is easy to play, but it's all attitude, so make sure to experiment with your pick angle and where in relation to the bridge and neck you pick, as it absolutely does play a role in how close or far you get to George's sound. This line works really well as an anchor of sorts because it paraphrases the earlier line. So it's almost as if we have like a call and response kind of thing reiterated in another spot a bit later. So the first call and the response, and then the second one and the response. This is the kind of thing that expert soloists will often do as a storytelling technique. And understanding this and recognizing it in other solos will give you a deeper appreciation for some of these players, and it's a skill that you can develop to use in your own work as well. George ends the solo with a really smooth Van Halen-esque tapped run that goes something like this. This is the kind of lick that might sound a bit faster than it actually is, so the key to nailing this one is to not rush it. Lay back a little bit and try to stay just ever so slightly behind the beat. That'll make it sound much smoother, and it'll feel even faster than if you were to rush it. I really think George Lynch did an outstanding job with this one, but the reason that I've always loved this solo, and I think the reason we're still talking about it today, is because it exists within the context of a phenomenal song. Dream Warriors really captures the vibe and the feel of Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, both in its darker aspects and in its lighter, more hopeful ones. And George's solo is really a perfect example of what we call a song within a song. It's like a condensed telling of the story. It's cinematic, theatrical, emotional, and flashy, which is exactly what this movie needed. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this one. Cheers.